A yellow SAR helicopter hovered over a cracked ice hole as a bull moose rose in a sling with a red-suited rescuer clipped beside him, black water widening under falling snow. On the pull-off above the guardrail, the responder kept a tarp low and a pike pole ready, holding controlled fear while hazard lights blinked behind a cone line. Fresh scuffs and a bent reflector stake with an old tape knot showed the moose had returned to this outlet scene before, and the storm plus a fuel window left no room for delay. Earlier that dusk, it was only a routine call at the same curve by the lake. Rotor thumps rolled over the frozen lake as a new crack spidered from the ice hole under the bull moose's chest, and dispatch repeated that the aircraft had 8 minutes before it had to peel off for fuel and the storm line. Snow stung her cheeks in the hood. The helicopter hovered close enough to rattle her ribs. A rescuer in a survival suit knelt at the rim, hands on the sling, while the moose fought to keep his legs under him. Steam poured from a pale muzzle. The left antler lacked a tine. The right ear showed a nick. Her fingers went numb on the radio as the seam crept toward their boots. She doubted the sling would hold once the rotor wash hit the moose's shoulders. So she moved anyway, sliding a rescue sled sideways to make a low windbreak. 2 cones went down in the snow to mark the only solid track they had tested with a pike pole. The moose's ears pinned toward the engine noise, then flicked back at the crack. 1 step forward and a hard freeze, as if the ice itself told him no. She kept her voice flat on the radio, asking the pilot to lift in inches, not yards, and watched the red-suited rescuer tighten the strap 1 notch. Static chewed her channel as she backed up to the shoreline sled, where a command bag sat half buried in snow. The dispatcher's voice dropped out, leaving only hiss in her ear, and the sat phone flashed low battery when she tried to wake it. The spare belly strap they wanted was still in a locked box back at the staging truck, a 1/4 mile up the access road. From the bank she could hear the mooses breathing over the rotor, sharp bursts that fogged the air above the hole. The rescuer looked up for a go signal she could not confirm, and the next decision had to be made without better tools. Wind shifted out of the pines, and the helicopter had to pull more power to hold position, the downdraft pushing snow in sheets across the hole. The crack she had marked with a glove tip widened into a dark line, and a low groan traveled through the lake like a distant door slamming. Her doubt came back: hard lift now and risk rolling the moose, or wait and lose the rim entirely, so she jabbed the pike pole into a safer angle and waved the rescuer back a half step. The pilot dipped the nose, readying for a slow, vertical pull that had to start before the next gust. Behind her, tires crunched fast on the plowed pull-off. Then brakes barked, too close for comfort on the slick grade down to the lake. A local utility truck nosed in with its hazard lights flashing, and the driver started to step out for a better look. She jogged up the short bank, boots slipping, and threw an arm out to stop him before he walked onto untested ice. The moose's head lifted at the new engine sound. Ears tracked it, body tightening into the same 1 step and freeze. She pointed the truck to park broadside as a shield, closing the lane before more lights appeared. A dark silhouette moved at the far end of the pull-off, ducking behind the guardrail where the bank dropped to the lake. She called out once, then ran, but the person had already gone down and left boot prints straight toward the tested line. At the edge, the prints ended at a scuffed patch beside the hole, and a strip of old survey tape trembled on a bent reflector stake. Out on the ice, the rescuer shifted weight, and the rim crumbled another inch under the moose's front leg. She was seconds too late to stop it, and the pilot's pitch changed as he felt the load move. She dropped to a knee at the safe edge and held the sled upright like a wall, turning her back to the rotor wash so it hit her, not the moose's eyes. The moose surged against the strap, then stopped one step, then stillness when the barrier cut the spinning snow. His breathing eased enough for the rescuer to slide the strap higher along the chest, clear of the throat. The helicopter rose a foot to test the load, and the ice answered with a sharp pop that carried across the lake. She signaled for a slow drift toward shore, knowing the next move had to be clean. Shore came closer, but the lake's outlet cut a darker ribbon under the snow, the kind of current that thins ice without warning. She spotted the same worn scuff line leading to it, as if hooves had tested this place on other nights, and a half-buried stake still carried a tight knot of faded tape. The pilot held hover while she searched for a set-down pad, and the rescuer kept hands on the sling to control the swing. Below them, the bull moose lifted his head and stared toward the bank, motionless except for steam, forcing her to choose the only safe landing. They set him down on a packed shelf of snow at the shoreline, still within reach of the sling, and the helicopter slid back to a higher hover. The bull moose did not bolt. He stood with legs wide, head low, steam rolling from his muzzle while he listened. His ears tracked the engine, then the darker water sound near the outlet, and he froze after a single step as if the ground shifted under him. She watched the ice behind them continue to craze, thin lines spreading where the hole had been, and realized the rescue was not finished once he touched land. Fuel calls are not suggestions, and the pilot signaled that he had one more minute before he had to climb out and turn south. She waved the rescuer back from the moose's blind side and pulled the sled and cones into a tighter corridor toward the trees. Rotor wash made the moose tense. His right ear nick twitched hard, and his shoulder coat showed a darker patch where the snow had melted and refrozen. When the helicopter finally lifted away, the sudden quiet felt heavier than the noise, and she could see the moose's eyes searching for the open lake again. A county plow rolled into the pull-off, blades raised, and the driver leaned out to ask when he could reopen the access road for the next shift. She kept her voice even and stepped between him and the bank, pointing at the boot prints that should not have been there and the cracked ice line under new snow. He wanted the lane cleared. She wanted distance, quiet, and no headlights washing the moose. Behind the guardrail, fresh hoof scuffs sat on top of older ones, as if this animal had paced this edge before. She ordered the plow to idle back, and his impatience became another hazard. Her radio cleared enough for one message. The wildlife officer was stuck behind a jackknifed rig, and no sedative team could reach the lake before dark. That left distance tools only vehicles as shields, tarp as a visual wall, and slow pressure. Headlights swept the trees from the access road, and the moose snapped to it at once, ears forward, body tight. He took one step toward the open ice and froze, refusing the corridor she had built. She inched the utility truck into his line, knowing the next trigger could send him back onto the lake. She drove the short mile to the rescue shed by the boat ramp, wipers scraping, and grabbed more cones, a roll of flagging, and a folded tarp that smelled of fuel. In the yard light, road salt streaked her bumper in the same fan pattern as the ice at the outlet, and she noticed hoofprints in the drift beside the door, half-filled and older. She told herself it was just a wild thing passing through. Then she saw a bent post by the ramp with antler rub marks that matched last season's notes in the call log. The idea of chance started to thin, and she headed back fast. Back at the access road curve, she caught him in the spill of her truck's low beams. The bull moose standing just beyond the guardrail, chest heaving, snow clinging to the darker patch on his shoulder. The missing tine on his left antler made the rack look slightly off balance when he turned. She killed the highlights and aimed a flashlight at the snow, not his eyes, then eased the truck broadside to close the lane. He tested the road with one step and froze, ears locked on the engine, and she held still long enough for him to choose the bank instead of the ice. The plow driver rolled forward again, tired of waiting, and the crunch of chains on packed snow snapped the moose's head back toward the lake. He pivoted, hooves skittering, and started for the outlet ribbon where the ice was already dark under fresh snow. She moved first, jogging to the guardrail and setting the tarp between his eyes and the open water like a clean curtain. Her truck sat angled as a barrier, engine idling low, and she held her ground without closing distance. The moose hit his pattern one step, then stoned stillness long enough for the danger to stop advancing. When the moose backed from the tarp, he did not flee. He drifted along the guardrail in a straight, familiar line, nose low as if tracking scent under snow. At the outlet, the bank was crusted white where plows had piled salt all winter, and the ice held the same shallow scuffs she had seen at the hole. The pull was practical. Minerals, easy access, an open path that promised more than it gave. He paused, breathed steady behind the barrier, then fixed his stare on the lake as if it owed him something, pulling her into the next decision. In the cab heat, her gloves dried on the dash while she scrolled through last winter's photos on the department tablet. A bull moose at the same lake access, the same off-balance rack with a missing tine, the same right ear nick caught in yard light near the boat ramp. She had written it off as another animal pushed by snow. Now the fresh scuffs by the guardrail sat over the old ones, and the bent reflector stake still carried a tight knot of faded tape. The pattern was older than tonight, and it pulled her attention to the outlet seam. 2 winters back, he worked the forest edge and stepped to the road shoulder at night where plows left a pale crust of salt. High beams hit him and he would stiffen, ears tracking engines. One step and then a hard freeze as if refusing motion made him safe. Early calls were small drivers reporting a shadow at the curve. Then nothing when patrol arrived. Her old note caught 2 markers. A darker patch on his shoulder and a single antler tap on a post before he turned. Those habits were still there, and they made headlights a bigger trigger than noise. The outlet had always been the trap. In late thaw, water moved under the snow there and left a thin skin of ice over current. She remembered a dawn call when tracks led straight to the dark ribbon, then a churned ring where a heavy animal had dropped through and fought back out. No gore, just broken crust and wide scrape marks of hooves searching for purchase. After that, the moose skirted the same guardrail line night after night, as if the lake had taught him a rule he could not ignore. Tonight, with the aircraft gone, that rule was pulling him again. Last year she stood at a dispatch counter with burnt coffee, hearing a caller complain about a moose blocking the ramp like it was a parking issue. When she drove out, the animal was gone, leaving steam dents in the snow and a fresh antler rub on the bent post by the ramp. She told herself the woods would pull him back once the salt crusted over. Then more reports came at the same hour, always at the curve before the lake, always after the plow pass, as if he timed his move to machines. She had missed the meaning, and that mistake followed her tonight. When the calls stacked up, a state crew tried a standard push. Vehicles wide, people spaced out, guiding him away from the access road and into timber. It should have worked, but the bull refused narrow gaps, stopping at culverts and ditch cuts like they were cages. One step forward, freeze, then a careful sidestep back to the open shoulder where he could see both ends. The crew backed off and he drifted right to the guardrail line again, tapping the post once with his antler as if marking it. That return made her wonder what the outlet meant to him. The day they used a small helicopter for aerial eyes. The downdraft blew snow into his face, and he broke into a blind trot along the guardrail. He did not charge. He just moved too fast on glare ice, legs splaying before he caught himself and stopped. From the road, it looked like stubbornness, but it was calculation. He needed room if his feet went out. After that, any engine note rising in pitch made his ears pin and his body lock. The same spike she saw tonight. It explained why calm barriers worked better than chasing, and why time stayed the enemy. Tonight, she watched him from behind the truck door with the tarp held low, giving him a corridor without pushing. He edged down the bank and stopped at the outlet seam as if he knew the exact line where ice turned weak. The darker patch on his shoulder rose and fell with steady breathing, and the right ear nick flicked toward distant traffic, then back to the water sound. He tapped the bent post once with his antler, a deliberate knock, and her earlier assumption fell apart. This was not only about salt. It was about a place he could not stop checking. In deep snow years, the plowed pull-off became his trail. She had seen it in photos. A wide track line pressed into the bank by his hooves, then repeated until it polished the snow into ice. Even when he vanished into timber, the line returned. Always from the same pines. Always to the guardrail. Always down to the outlet and back. The county kept straightening the reflector stake. It bent again, and the tape knot reappeared every week. Those signs made the animal feel less like a visitor and more like a hazard written into the winter map. A wildlife tech once pointed out willow flats on the far shore, the last good browse when ridges crusted over, and the shortest approach ran across this lake. On paper, it was simple. In winter, it meant stepping near the outlet current or taking a detour through drifts and tight culverts. He refused. She saw it in the tracks. He approached the seam, tested it, froze, then backed out and paced the guardrail again, trapped between need and memory. Her job was supposed to end when the aircraft left, but his return made that impossible. If she drove away, he would try the seam again without shields. Snow built on the guardrail, but he stood beside it like a marker, eyes on the open lake and ears on the road. Each time traffic faded, he edged forward, one step and freeze, waiting for the ice to offer a different answer. She felt the pull in her own chest duty mixed with the knowledge that a living thing had learned the wrong lesson from a near miss and kept returning to confirm it. He was not wandering. He was committed to a crossing he believed he had to make. If she wanted a different outcome, she had to change the route before the storm closed in. The bull drifted back to the curve as daylight failed, not into the woods, and stopped with his shoulder almost touching the guardrail. He faced the lake access like it was a doorway, ears forward, body set in that one step and freeze. She held the tarp low and watched his breathing steady in the quiet pocket behind her truck. Then he angled his rack and tapped the bent post once, a clean knock that echoed off the rail, and he stared down the bank toward the outlet seam. It read like a mark, not a threat, and it pushed her to look for what he was warning her about. She left a deputy and the plow to hold the pull-off and drove to the county yard for barricades, wheels sliding on packed snow. Under the yard lights, she grabbed orange sawhorses and a bag of sand, loading them fast with numb hands. On the radio, the deputy reported the moose still at the rail, not moving, only breath and an occasional hoof scrape on ice. That scrape traveled through the speaker like a timer, and she pictured the scuffed patch at the outlet widening. She slammed the tailgate and headed back, betting on his stillness to buy her minutes. When she returned, The bull had stepped into the access road and stood broadside, filling the lane from snowbank to center line. He was not charging or fleeing. He was blocking. Head low, ears working, missing tine showing as he turned. The deputy kept distance while she set the sawhorses behind her truck and walked cones into a taper, forcing cars to stop back. A driver rolled down a window to complain, but she kept her hand up and her voice calm, holding protocol over convenience. The moose took one step, froze, and held the lane as if he needed her to see what he had measured. A pickup tried to nose around the cones, impatient, and she stepped to the driver's mirror and pointed him back with a flat, practiced gesture. She kept her body turned so she could see the moose and the truck at once, never closing the gap to the animal. The bull's ears snapped to the idling engine, then eased when she angled her own vehicle to block the glare and cut the line of sight. Steam rose steady from his muzzle instead of in bursts, a small change that told her the barrier mattered. She held the road, and the crowd noise faded behind the wind, leaving space for the next move. He broke stillness without panic, stepping off the lane to the shoulder and pawing twice at the snow where the bank dipped. The motion was heavy but controlled, scraping down to wet, darker ice that glistened under powder. She moved her flashlight beam to the ground and saw a narrow culvert outflow, warm enough to undercut the edge like the lake outlet. The bull stopped pawing and looked back at her, then at the seam, ears forward, waiting. Something clicked. He was mapping weak ice, and he had just shown her the next trap, right where drivers would step to get a better view. She set a sawhorse across the shoulder and tossed sand onto the slick patch, then shifted the cones so nobody could walk down to the bank. The deputy angled the plow, making a wall between the moose and idling traffic. With the glare blocked, the bull took one step from the lake and froze, then another, testing the corridor she had built toward thicker timber. She stayed behind the tarp, keeping distance, and watched his breathing stay even as the road sound softened. The moment felt like permission earned through restraint, and she knew it would vanish if engines rose again. She ran to the rescue shed to check the weather feed on a hardwired screen, the only signal that held when radios went thin. A band of heavier snow was already crossing the ridgeline, and the wind arrows turned toward the lake. Bad for hover work. Outside, fresh hoofprints cut through the drift toward the ramp, then turned back, as if the bull had tested the pull while she was gone. She called in a request for the helicopter to refuel and stand by, adding that ground-only control was failing against current and ice. She drove back with the sense of a deadline closing. At the pull-off, the bull had turned from the outlet and now faced the timber line, as if the blocked lane changed his math. She held the tarp low and walked it slowly along the edge of his vision, creating a wall that guided without closing distance. He followed in measured steps, freezing after each one to listen, then moving when he heard only wind and the plow's low idle. Steam from his muzzle came slower, steadier, and his ears stopped pinning toward engines. For the first time he chose her corridor over the lake, and she protected that choice by keeping every light pointed down. A gust slapped the tarp, and the snap of fabric made the bull flinch and pivot back toward the bank. His hooves hit a glazed spot near the culvert outflow and slid a half step before he caught himself, ears locked forward. She backed away to give room and signaled the deputy to kill the engine for 10 seconds, cutting the sound that fed his panic. In the quiet, he froze, then eased weight back onto firmer snow, breathing hard but controlled. She set another line of cones and told the deputy she was staying through the storm band, because leaving would push him to test the seam alone. She set the last barricade and took a position where she could see the outlet seam and the safer corridor at once. Shoulders squared into the wind. The bull stood beyond the tarp, head low, watching the lake with that hard stillness. Behind her, the plow idled and taillights stacked in a patient red line. The radio cut clean through the hiss. The helicopter was airborne again, and the storm front was 6 miles out, leaving one narrow window. As the first heavy flakes hit, the pilot called for a landing zone and warned that the next gust could put the moose back through the ice. Radio static cleared long enough for the pilot to speak. Tight and fast. He had one narrow hover window before the storm wall hit the lake. Now, 6 miles out and moving. Her hazard lights strobed against falling snow as she marked a landing zone on the pull-off with cones and a low flare, keeping every beam aimed down. Beyond the guardrail, the bull moose stood with head dropped, breath fog rolling. Missing tine pointed at the outlet seam. Ice groaned under him like a door settling. The cold bit through her hood, and trucks stacked behind the barricade, forcing her next move. She swung the utility truck broadside as a shield and lifted the tarp to cut rotor wash and headlight glare, turning the bank into a darker corridor. The moose tested the shoulder one step, then freeze beside the bent reflector stake where the old tape knot trembled. Breath fog pooled under his muzzle, and his ears tracked RPM. A driver crept toward the cone line with a phone up, tires crunching. She walked to his mirror, flat palm out, and held him there until he backed off, then reset 2 cones and checked the flare, because the aircraft would only commit if the lane stayed quiet. The storm reached the tree line sooner than forecast, snow thickening to white sheets that erased the far shore. The flare sputtered and nearly disappeared under drifting powder, and radio static crept back into her earpiece. Dispatch warned the highway crew wanted the curve reopened for a fuel convoy. No exceptions, and a supervisor was already on the way. Doubt hit hard, so she flagged the plow to stack snow as a barricade and ordered the deputy to push cars farther back. The moose tracked the plow's rising pitch, ears pinning, and his hooves slid toward the lake edge. A gust snapped the tarp and the crack of fabric spiked him. He slipped through a guardrail gap and dropped onto the lake edge, where crust looked solid until it sagged under his weight. Breath fog burst from his muzzle. The darker shoulder patch heaved as he tried to turn. She ran to the tested line with a pike pole, boots biting into glare ice, and signaled the pilot to hold altitude. Behind her, a pickup's brakes chirped and slid, and the cone taper narrowed under tire spray, compressing the safe corridor into one thin track in front of her. She probed fast and found hollow ice under a dusting of snow where the outlet current ran. The moose stood half on that skin, half on firmer shelf, refusing the tight bank cut he hated, and his ears pinned at the helicopter's pitch. The wildlife officer broke through, voice delayed, saying sedative support was still blocked and paperwork was hung up in a jurisdiction dispute. Her plan shrank to barriers and timing as rotor thump hammered the lake. The crack line turned dark and crawled toward the bull's chest, forcing her to call the pilot in lower despite the wind. 2 tourists ducked under the sawhorse for a closer look, boots sliding toward the bank. She intercepted them, a voice low but hard, and pointed at the scuffed ice ring and fresh wet sheen near their toes. One argued the helicopter would handle it and tried to step around her, phone still raised. She held protocol, pushed them back behind the truck shield, and ordered the deputy to lock the lane, even as a supervisor's SUV rolled up with reflector glare. In the gap she left, the bull edged forward 1 step. Freeze. Then the shelf gave a soft sigh that still carried across open water. The bull's front legs dropped to his knees, Not deep enough to vanish, but enough to drag his chest toward the hole. He surged, stopped, and the sling marks from earlier showed in wet hair without blood. She saw the same churned ring from past seasons, now fresh and widening at the outlet seam. She signaled the pilot to hover over the current side, away from the road, and waved the rescuer in the red suit down the tested track. The rescuer's boots hit the ice as wind rose, and the moose's ears locked on the engine note, building toward another lunge. Setback came fast. One cone skittered across the plowed surface and slid under a passing tire, forcing the driver to brake and fishtail near the pull-off. She sprinted, yanked the cone free, and rebuilt the taper with sand, breath burning in her throat. The supervisor demanded the lane reopened in 10 minutes, pointing at the queued convoy, and she refused without raising her voice. Radio static ate half the pilot's words, but she caught the key. He could not hold hover long in this crosswind. On the ice, the bull jolted again, widening the hole by inches and forcing the next step. The rescuer reached the rim and crouched, hands on the strap, while she held the tarp steady to block snow swirl from the moose's eyes. The bull tapped the bent post once with his antler, then froze, breath fog steadier behind the barrier. He was not fighting her corridor now. He was searching for purchase that would not crack. She killed her truck headlights and aimed a flashlight at the snow, cutting a dark path toward shore while hazard lights blinked behind the barricade. The moose shifted one hoof toward that lane, then stopped, waiting for the rotor to drop closer. Wind slammed across the lake and the helicopter yawed, rotor wash tearing the surface into spindrift. The strap slipped a few inches as the moose bucked, and the rescuer grabbed it to keep it from riding up. Ice fractured outward with a sharp pop that reached the pull-off, and the hole widened under the bull's chest. She held her arm up for a pause, then forced herself to wave the pilot on, because waiting meant losing the rim entirely. The bull hung in the worst position, front half sinking, back legs scrambling, leaving one clean plan: lift now with the rescuer still on the ice. The pilot dipped into the wind, rotor thump hammering the ice, and she answered with a steady arm signal from the pull-off. Hazard lights and reflector glare marked the safe edge while snow stung her face through the hood. On the ice, the rescuer in the red suit threaded a secondary strap under the bull's chest, working by touch as breath fog rolled over his knees. A gust shoved the helicopter sideways, and the bull's ears pinned at the rising pitch. She dragged the tarp 2 steps to block the swirl and called for a lower, slower lift that could not rise more than a foot at a time. The line tightened and the bull rose a few inches, then twisted as one back hoof skated on wet ice. The rescuer grabbed the sling to steady him, and for a second both moose and human hung at the lip of the hole. She saw the strap bite into the ice rim and signaled a pause, then tossed a tag line from shore to the rescuer's hand. Radio static swallowed the pilot's acknowledgement, so she repeated the hand signal, slow and flat. With the tagline anchored to the utility truck, swing reduced, and the next lift could start without turning them into a pendulum. A new wave of cars reached the curve and headlight glare washed the snow, spiking the bull's ears even from the ice. One driver ignored the deputy's stop and nosed toward the pull-off, bumping a cone into the ditch. She stepped into the lane, arm out, and forced him back behind the plow wall while hazard lights flashed in his windshield. The supervisor demanded reopening, and she refused, pointing at the crack line visible as a dark seam under rotor wash. She reset the cone taper wider, buying the pilot airspace and giving the moose less noise to fight. The pilot held hover over the cracked hole, yellow helicopter centered above the white lake. and the hoist motor whined in the storm. The bull rose, chest clearing the rim, and the rescuer stayed clipped to the line, boots on ice until the last second. Rotor wash drove snow sideways. Blurred pines framed the lake, and breath fog streamed off the moose's muzzle. Then the rim broke again, and the rescuer stepped into open air, one hand on the sling to keep the bull from rolling. From the pull-off, she watched moose and rescuer rise together, suspended cleanly above the widening black water. Setback hit mid-hoist when the tagline iced over and slipped in her gloves, letting the load drift a foot toward the outlet current. The bull swung, antlers tilting, and the rescuer used his body as a brake. Knees bent, staying clear of the rack without touching the face. She wrapped the tagline twice around the truck hitch and leaned back, using the vehicle's weight to damp the motion. Radio static broke, then cleared, and the pilot called that his tail was getting pushed by the gusts. She answered with a new landing vector toward the shoreline shelf, cones guiding the only safe arc. The shoreline shelf they had used earlier was already softening under rotor wash, and snow hid the edge where ice met slush. She drove a flare into the packed snow and set 3 cones tight around it, making a triangle the pilot could see through whiteout. The plow shifted to widen the barricade, but its engine note rose and the bull's ears pinned again as he hung in the air. She signaled the driver to idle down and killed her own cab fan so her radio would hear clean. The pilot descended in inches, and she held the tarp as a windbreak, ready for the moment hooves touched down. Hooves hit the shelf with a heavy thud, and the bull tried to surge forward, legs splaying once before he caught himself. The rescuer unclipped and backed away on the tested line, keeping his hands visible and distance wide. Headlight glare from the curve flared again as a car crept up, and the moose turned toward it, trigger rising in his posture. She stepped between glare and animal with the tarp, flashlight aimed at the snow, and the utility truck angled to block the beam. The bull took one step, froze, then chose her darker corridor, moving off the shelf and away from the black seam. The pilot called fuel minimum and climbed out, yellow body fading into the snow curtain, leaving only rotor echo and radio hiss. The supervisor stepped close, demanding the road opened now, and she held her ground beside the cones. She pointed at the outlet seam still cracking and at fresh hoof scuffs leading back to the guardrail line. To keep the bull from circling toward traffic, she ordered the plow to stay broadside and the deputy to extend the taper with more cones. Hazard lights blinked in the storm as the moose paced once, then froze, choosing between road noise and timber. She walked the tarp forward a yard at a time, never closing distance, and the bull followed in measured steps, freezing after each one to listen. Breath fog stayed steady now, and his ears stopped pinning at every engine surge behind the barricade. At the tree line, he paused by the bent reflector stake and tapped his antler once, then angled away from the lake. She marked the bank with a cone, noting the old scuff line and salt stains that had pulled him here before. The deputy asked if they were done. She answered with a quiet headshake and a call to stage at the clinic lot for observation. With the bull off the ice and out of the road's kill zone, she finally let her shoulders drop an inch, then tightened back up. The moose stood just inside timber, head low, steam rising, dark shoulder patch trembling with fatigue rather than panic. She kept the corridor open with cones and one flare at the curve, then radioed for a stock trailer and a wildlife tech to meet at the clinic parking area. Paperwork and pressure could wait until he was stable, but the storm still pushed at their backs. She turned from the tree line toward the idling trucks, ready to defend the closure one more time. The clinic parking area was lit by sodium lamps that turned snow orange, and the wind still carried rotor echo in her ears. The stock trailer backed in slow while the deputy set cones as a quiet funnel. The bull moose stood at the edge of the lot, kept at distance by tarp and truck angles, breath fog drifting across his knees. A wildlife tech checked him with binoculars, calling out steady respiration and cold stress. No obvious fracture. She signed the first form on a clipboard that shook in the gusts, knowing paperwork was now part of the rescue. They did not rush him, because rushing made him freeze and then bolt. She held a visual wall with the tarp while the tech set a portable panel fence, giving the bull an open corridor into the trailer without tight corners. His ears tracked every hinge sound. The right ear nick twitched, then settled when headlights stayed off and voices stayed low. A shallow tub of water sat just inside the corridor for recovery, and he took 2 cautious sniffs without stepping in. The tech noted rubbed hair where the sling had sat and marked it for follow-up as she watched for the next stress spike. The supervisor arrived in the lot with a wet parka and a face set for argument, saying the highway crew lost hours and wanted a report now. She kept her tone even, laid out the timeline, and pointed to the cone plan and the radio log with its gaps of static. He pushed for blame. She pushed for protocol, reminding him a panicked bull moose on thin ice becomes a fatality for animal or driver. Behind them, the bull stood still. 1 step, then freeze, tracking the voices with his ears. She ended it by asking for a written reopening order, and when he would not sign, the closure held. She noticed road salt scuffs on his hooves, white crust packed into the grooves, and it matched the pull-off at the lake. Plows had fed that habit all winter, drawing him back at the same hour. The old scuff line by the guardrail, the bent reflector stake. Even the tape knot were markers of an easy mineral route to Willow Flats on the far shore. A past relocation likely set him on the wrong side of that route, so he kept returning to the same curve to correct it. That realization changed the plan from extraction to redirecting his corridor before he tried the outlet again. After midnight, the wind dropped and the lot went quiet, but the bull started edging toward the fence gap that led back to the access road. He took 1 step, froze, then sidestepped as if measuring the opening, ears tipped toward traffic. The tech raised a hand for no sudden moves, and she repositioned 2 trucks to close the sightline, hazard lights blinking low through snow. She reset 3 cones to widen the safer corridor toward a darker service lane behind the clinic. The bull paused, breath fog steady, then turned away from the gap, choosing the lane that did not smell like road salt. At first light, she cleaned ice grit off the pike pole and dried the tarp, hands stiff, while the deputy stacked cones for the report photo. The rescuer checked his harness for frayed stitching and logged the load angles for aviation. Across the lot, the bull stood in a sheltered corner, head low, coat rimed with frost, missing tine easy to spot. He watched openings, tracking motion with his ears and freezing when anything changed. Fatigue sat in her legs, but the aftershock risk stayed real until he was away from roads and salt for good. The tech photographed the right ear nick and the darker shoulder patch for ID without approaching, then noted no collar. She attached photos of the bent reflector stake and the tape knot to the report as pattern evidence tied to the lake access. A call from the highway desk warned resources were thin and the curve would be reopened by noon. She watched the bull angle toward the service lane as if testing it for escape, breath fog thick in the cold air. She tightened the cone line and requested 1 more hour of escort time, because a single mistake would put him back on pavement. She had assumed the trailer was the only answer, but watching him choose the darker lane showed he could be guided if the corridor stayed wide. That turn changed the plan. escort him to a quiet release site inland, away from salt and open water. She chose a route with no bridges and no tight culverts, ending at a service gate into timber. The deputy questioned the risk. She agreed, then said keeping him near the lake only guaranteed another return. She radioed for temporary closure signs and asked the plow to stage at the curve again, because the escort would start before noon. They opened the trailer as a backup, ramped down, but the bull refused the tight angle, stopping at the threshold and freezing hard. She widened the panel fence and re-aimed the corridor to the service lane, using the trailer as a wall instead of a destination. Hazard lights blinked low. Cones lined the asphalt, and her flashlight stayed on the ground to avoid his trigger. After a long, still moment, he stepped once, froze, then stepped again, choosing open space over the ramp. The tech noted steadier breathing behind the tarp, and she committed to an on-foot escort to the gate. By late morning, the storm band weakened, but road crews grew impatient, and the supervisor's calls kept coming. She ignored the pressure and watched the bull's feet for the one-step freeze that warned of overload. Cones were restacked, flare caps checked, tarp ready for a moving wall. She briefed the deputy and plow driver on hand signals, then set the first cone at the service lane mouth. When the bull followed that marker instead of the smell of salt, she chose escort over transport and started the slow walk toward release without haste. The escort moved at walking speed along the service lane behind the clinic, the plow rolling ahead as a slow shield and the deputy trailing with hazard lights. She carried the tarp folded, opening it only when a gust lifted snow or a vehicle sound drifted in from the main road. The bull followed the cone line in measured steps, freezing after each one, ears working the air for engines. Hoofprints stamped a straight track in new powder, and the salt smell faded with every yard. At the service gate, the bull paused, breath fog steady, waiting for the opening that would decide the day. The gate chain was half frozen, and her gloves slipped on the metal as she worked it loose with slow, careful pulls. On the radio, a land manager warned about a snowmobile trail beyond the trees and asked for assurance no one would follow the moose. She answered with a plan. Cones at the clinic exit, plow at the curve, and one deputy posted until tracks disappeared. The bull stayed back from the tight gap, then sidestepped to a wider opening where the fence sagged. She moved a cone to mark that line, and he chose it, stepping through without panic. Beyond the gate, the world changed fast. No reflector glare, no tire hiss, only wind in spruce and the soft rasp of his hooves in powder. She kept distance and used the tarp only as a moving edge, never crowding him into tight timber. The tech stopped once to check posture and breathing through binoculars, confirming the bull carried weight evenly and the shoulder patch rise and fall had slowed. A final flare stayed unlit in her pocket, saved for emergency rather than drama. They angled him toward a low willow draw where the snow lay smoother, and she felt the rescue turning into release. A distant engine buzzed through the trees, likely a snowmobile on the marked trail, and the bull's ears snapped toward it. He took one step, froze, and his chest lifted with a sharper breath, ready to turn back. She opened the tarp to block the sightline and angled the plow down the spur so its engine became a steady, predictable wall. The deputy cut his lights and let the hazard flash slow, reducing the strobe, cones stacked at his feet. In that pocket, the bull's breath fog steadied again, and he resumed the inland line, choosing timber over noise. The willow draw opened like a quiet bowl, snow unbroken except for wind ripples, and the bull stopped at its rim. He stood with head low, weight shifting once through the front legs as if testing what the ice had taken out of him. Breath fog drifted in a slow sheet, not the frantic bursts from the lake, and his ears rotated without pinning. She stayed back by a spruce trunk and let the corridor dissolve, giving him room to decide without pressure. After a long still moment, he took 2 steps forward, then froze again, scanning, and the choice of direction became his alone. Her radio crackled clearer away from the lake, and the supervisor asked again when the curve would reopen. She answered with facts. The bull was inland, the ice zone abandoned, and cones would stay until tracks proved he would not turn back. The deputy photographed fresh hoofprints heading deeper into willows, a clean line that did not angle toward salt. The tech logged time and temperature, then signaled observation could end if the bull kept moving with purpose. She watched the missing tine pass between branches and felt the rescue tightening into closure. At the far end of the draw, the bull rubbed one antler along a young spruce, a slow scrape that left resin scent in the cold. It matched his earlier tap on the bent post, a habit of marking, not bonding. He breathed once, deep, shifted weight, then stepped forward, freezing briefly to listen for engines that were no longer close. Snow sifted off his coat as he moved, the darker shoulder patch rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She let the distance widen until his shape broke into the trees, then turned back toward the vehicles to close the loop. Back at the lake curve, the pull-off was half buried, cones standing like short orange posts against fresh snow. The outlet seam was hidden, but the cracked pattern still showed under a thin glaze, and the bent reflector stake leaned with its tape knot fluttering. The plow driver helped stack cones into the bed while the deputy scraped ice from the sawhorse legs. Hazard lights blinked once more, then went dark, leaving wind and the faint sound of current under ice. She logged a repair request for the guardrail gap and drove away, knowing the inland gate route offered the bull a safer answer. At the station break room, the heaters clicked, and the smell of wet gear filled the air as she hung the tarp to dry. No one celebrated. They reviewed the radio gaps, the cone failure, and the moment the ice gave way, because the next storm would not be kinder. The rescuer left a note about strap placement and crosswind limits, and she added a line about keeping headlights down around wildlife. Outside the window, snow kept falling in slow layers, softening the town's edges. She signed the final report and placed it on the desk, letting facts speak and the day settle. Before going off shift, she drove to the inland gate and walked only far enough to see evidence, not the animal. A single line of fresh tracks crossed the willow draw and disappeared into spruce. Steady spacing. No back and forth scuffing. The wind softened the edges, but the direction held true. Away from road salt and away from the lake. She stood still, hearing only trees and her own breath, then turned back without shining a light into timber. She passed the stacked cones in the truck bed and understood the rescue for what it was. A clean corridor, a hard lift, and a bull moose moving on. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1-inch the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.